Hello and welcome to the Franz Van Cat interview. I'm Annette Young. It's been called the curse of the black gold, and nowhere do you find it more than in Africa. I'm talking about, of course, oil. And once again, it's a source of conflict between the two Sudans who are battling over a disputed oil field. But how much does the West's demand for oil contribute to the chronic problems plaguing this continent? African specialist and frequent guest here at Franz Van Cat, Douglas Yates, has bravely sought to answer that question in a book he's written. It's called The Scramble for African Oil, and he joins me here in the studio today. And of course, Douglas, when you're not writing books, you're a professor at the American University in Paris. First of all, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me on and for giving me the chance to speak about this research.
Firstly, before we attempt to solve Africa's oil curse in less than 11 minutes, let me begin by talking to you about the conflict between the two Sudans. Now, as we've discussed this before, you and I on air, as well as talking about oil, it's also the sign of a messy divorce, isn't it? When you haven't actually properly sorted out the custody arrangements.
I love that metaphor. I wish I had had it when I was writing the book. I would have used it. A messy divorce describes very well Sudan. 2 years ago, we would have just spoken of Sudan, perhaps an ongoing civil war that had been settled. And now it's a fait accompli. We have two countries, but they haven't managed to settle all of their separation issues. For example, their border, and most of all, the division of their oil resources.
How much does that oil revenue drive this whole dispute, though?
Well, it's funny. This was a war that originally was not about oil. This was a war about identity. And what's happened is, as the oil money came in, and that was in the late 90s and early 2000s, both of these countries became completely dependent on oil revenues. That's the crux of a series of problems. It's very difficult, once you depend on oil revenues, to imagine a world where you do something else. And so two countries that had fought over identity are now fighting over oil.
But it's the case, isn't it, where the Sudan has the refineries and South Sudan has the oil. I mean, one can't go, cope without the other, clearly.
That's right. Originally, the theories about Sudan were that oil was, in a way, flaming or fueling the flames of this conflict. And then ideas came up, well, perhaps in fact, because they have to share this resource and because they've split things up, oil could become a source for peace. I think whether or not these two countries return to war or maintain themselves in peace will be a critical test of those two theories. Does oil cause war, or can it be a cause for peace?
Well, this is what I want to do now, is bring you back to your book, and you write about the terrible paradox that contrasts the abundance of oil wealth in certain African countries versus the extreme poverty of its citizens. In short, why does this occur? Because it's something that we in the West never quite get our head around, do we?
Okay, there are many very good explanations. Usually people think, well, the reason they're poor is the leaders are corrupt. There is great corruption, but it's really an inadequate answer. There was a theory developed by an Iranian economist called rentier state theory that showed how whether or not you have a good government or a bad government, oil is going to cause your economy to shift. It's going to turn your bureaucrats into a rentier class, the richest people in the country. It's going to make the whole society have a mentality where what they want is they want a cut of the oil money, a something-for-nothing mentality, akin to winning lottery. It'll undermine your economic incentives because your money won't be invested in anything but the oil industry.
And it's not a labour-intensive industry, is it?
It doesn't provide much employment at all. In fact, what they've learned, the oil companies, is that if you want to fight that part of the curse, you need to create jobs early on, because after the first few years, most of the need for local labor goes away, and then you get problems like the Niger Delta.
So does oil need to be such a curse?
There are some countries that have escaped the oil curse. For example, Norway. And some people point to some of the Persian Gulf Emirates that have successfully invested their money. So no, it's not deterministic. But when you've got fragile states and post-colonial nations that are in the form of being created and very weak entrepreneurial classes, plus where you have a weakness that allows you to be exploited by others, through a debt crisis, then everything's in place for a curse. I think it's a matter of susceptibility. Whether or not you catch a cold probably depends on what your constitution is like.
But what you're talking about is some massive structural flaws. I mean, these are things that can't be fixed easily.
No, and worse than that, the oil actually makes it difficult for them to pursue the kinds of changes that they need. If you're relying on unearned oil revenue, and that's what it is, none of these countries made the oil, it took millions of years to make, then you're not pursuing other things. What we know is that necessity is the mother of invention, and having a free ride with billions of dollars of unearned oil revenue keeps you from pursuing the kind of change that you need. And unfortunately, when you combine this in the African states, 8 out of the 10 leaders of the oil countries are military men who came to power by coup d'etat or by civil war, who've created personal rule, family dynasties, kleptocracies. It's made it very difficult for these countries to invest their oil revenues, like Venezuela has, in social development.
And it's not just former colonial rulers who are benefiting from this industry. I mean, for instance, China has become a key player in that part of the world, hasn't it?
And that the title of the book, The Scramble for African Oil, precisely points to that. We've been exploiting oil in Africa since World War II, effectively, but it's all been on the coast. The scramble for Africa was a period in African history where the European powers pushed into the interior. And what we've seen since the end of the Cold War is the Americans, the British, the French, then the Chinese, the Malaysians, the Indians have all pushed into the interior, into areas like Sudan, or like Niger, or like Chad, or the most recent producer, Uganda. And this push for the interior has not only allowed new actors to come in, but it's allowed us to see how the weakness of the states almost guarantee a kind of curse. Uganda and Ghana are the new test cases.
But I'm particularly interested in China because they've started to play a very important role in mediating between Sudan and South Sudan. I mean, it's giving them a growing world power, even more punch in that part of the world.
Yeah, China's become, if you will, the most fashionable actor in African studies because of the way that they spread across all of these countries. It had taken decades for the British, the French, the Americans, and other actors to enter into Africa. China did it in basically a decade. And what they were able to do was build pipelines. The presence of this oil was known since the end of World War II, but no one wanted to invest in pipelines. No one was willing to go through war-torn regions. China demonstrated a can-do approach, but it did so with a kind of naive understanding of African politics. They thought they could just do business and not concern themselves with democracy, corruption, or conflict. And Sudan has proven that China's strategy was wrong. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is China actually learning. For example, when they opened up an embassy in South Sudan and began to recognize the very people whom they had helped to massacre during years. China's doing environmental protection now in Chad and Niger, where it's extending the reviews. So I think China is learning, but the image of China in oil is a dirty player willing to fund corrupt dictatorships, only interested in meeting its own national interests.
Not surprisingly, Douglas, in your book, corruption plays a very large part. But it occurs in many places around the world, not just in Africa, when the state is weak and the tribe is strong, when you can't rely on the state to provide, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And how does that play out in Africa? It's not just strictly an African problem, it's a worldwide problem. So what needs to be done in order to fix corruption, particularly in Africa?
I'm so glad you asked that, because normally the people's first answer to the question, why are these countries so poor, is corruption. And if we hope to get rid of corruption from the hearts of men, we have no chance. So what can we actually do short of trying to make perfect men? And the answer lies in creating better institutions. Corruption can be understood through a formula that basically it's where state actors or some actors have a monopoly, where there's no accountability for their action. And so what you can create are institutions that create accountability. For example, where you have one person who makes a decision, you can have two. Make people work in teams, break up tasks over several roles. Where a person is alone and has total discretion, they can be corrupt. Where others are watching them, they can't. But also, there are things that you can do for accountability. Usually on the books, there are laws to fight corruption, but they're so strict they become impossible to enforce. And so tailoring the punishments, giving a range of punishments from modest punishments to very extreme allows these rules to actually be enforced. There's also, of course, the need for greater accountancy and efforts by international organizations to fight for more transparency. A transparent environment is like turning the lights on in the kitchen. The cockroaches have to go under the refrigerator. And where people are being observed, they behave differently.
Finally, and very briefly, Douglas, in energy terms, East Africa has been long the continent's poor cousin. But that's all about to change, with Kenya now having been sent into delirium as a result of this oil strike in March. It looks like the vicious cycle is set to continue.
Right. Unfortunately, if the oil curse is true, any country that's in the third world that finds great amounts of oil should be cursed. But what we see is agency can matter. There are solutions. And one of the key actors are the corporations. In East Africa, there are some new actors, corporate actors, who weren't big players before, who've tried to learn the lessons of the Niger Delta. One of them, for example, is Tullow Oil, which is what was a small Irish company that's developed famously Ugandan oil. What they try to do is they try to hire locals. Early on, they create schools to train locals to work in the oil industry. They get involved in revenue management. They try to do environmental cleanups. That is, there is a learning process, and some of these new corporate actors could be so decisive that they could stop the oil curse from happening.
Douglas Yates, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for being with us today. And that's it for this edition of the Frans van Catra interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up very shortly indeed. Chat.